All right, this is the first session of 4, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the other speakers have to say today. Resurrection of Jesus, fact or myth? Charles Maurice de Havilland was a French statesman and diplomat noted for his capacity to survive politically. He held high office during the French Revolution under Napoleon. He was approached one day by a dejected friend who was trying unsuccessfully to start a new religion that he said was better than Christianity. Talleyrand agreed that there were formidable difficulties to starting a new religion, but he offered some advice. He said to him, "Why don't you get yourself crucified and rise again 3 days later?" And that is the central issue that we are going to examine today. This is one of the most important questions of all of history. If Jesus arose from the dead, then what he said about himself is true. If he did not rise from the dead, then what he said about himself is not true. Jesus claimed to be the only way to God. He claimed to be able to forgive sins. He also claimed to be divine. Therefore, his extraordinary claims are tied to his bodily resurrection. There are serious implications if Jesus did not rise bodily from the dead. Now, we're going to consider these in 4 sessions today, and I will concentrate on the evidence for the resurrection. I will try to avoid wandering into those very important issues of the spiritual implications of the resurrection, because that will be covered by the other speakers. So we'll try to stick to just the facts. Now, we're going to look at this by looking at in light of 4 questions. What does the Bible say? What does history say? What do the critics say? And what do authorities say? All right, first of all, what does the Bible say? Well, it was prophesied, his resurrection was prophesied in the Old Testament. In Psalms, David was led to write, "For you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." Now, Sheol is the Old Testament word for the place of the dead. And, of course, his body would not see corruption because God miraculously kept his body from corrupting during those 3 days. Now, we know that was about Jesus' resurrection because Peter spoke about it on the day of Pentecost. He said, "The patriarch David, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption." Now, Hades is the New Testament equivalent of the place of the departed dead. It is not hell. If you use the KJV, hell is used in both those places. That is not correct. Jesus did not go to hell. Hell is a place of torment made for the devil and his angels. Now, Jesus predicted his own resurrection. He said to his disciples, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify. And the 3rd day he will rise again." Jesus spoke very clearly about his resurrections. His disciples didn't seem to understand that. He said again, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Only 3 days and 3 nights? That means he won't be staying there. Now, all 4 Gospels give much detail about Jesus' resurrection. You have this table in your notes, so you don't have to write it all down. Now, there's too much detail for us to go through every reference, and we won't be doing so. But one thing does stand out in these records, and it is the simplicity and frankness of the writings. They're simply stating facts so that the church could know the truth. Now, not only in the Gospels, but we find references in other New Testament parts. Luke in Acts and Paul in his letter to the Corinthians add to what is in the Gospels. And together, these give us a very comprehensive record of all the times that Jesus appeared to the people on that day of his resurrection and for the following 40 days. The resurrection is actually spoken of more than 100 times in the New Testament. Now, again, we won't be going through these, but we'll look at a few of them more closely soon. Now, there is an important point we need to remember here. Matthew, Mark and Luke were written before AD 70, before the temple was destroyed and there was still a Jewish nation in existence. The new day began at 6 p.m. and the night and the day were each divided into 4 3-hour periods or watches. Now, John's Gospel was written around AD 90 to 95, and of course the temple had been destroyed, the Jewish nation had been disbanded, and so he's using Roman time. Roman time, of course, begins as we do today, at midnight. And so you have to be careful not to confuse the timings in John and the timings in the other Gospels. Now, there was resurrection before this time. Elijah resurrected the son of Zarephath's widow. Elisha resurrected the Shunammite woman's son. And a dead man came back to life incredibly when he touches Elisha's bones. Restoration to life had occurred prior to the New Testament, and these 3 people are recorded as having been raised. Now, when we come to the New Testament, there are, in addition to Jesus, there are 5 people raised from the dead. The widow's son at Nain, Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, then Peter raised Tabitha, and Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. Remember, he was sitting in a windowsill and Paul spoke too long and he fell out the window and killed himself. And he was raised from death. Now, I'm not speaking that long, don't worry. Okay, so 8 normal humans were raised from death in Scripture. Now, it is important to realise that all of these died again. In fact, it would be better to use the word resuscitation rather than resurrection when we speak about those people. They were not given resurrection bodies, as was Christ. You'll hear more about that resurrection body in the 3rd session today. Now, there were others raised to life at about the same time. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, it's important that we realise that's after the resurrection, after Jesus' resurrection. Christ was the first fruits of those that would rise from the dead. Now, presumably, as far as we can understand, the Old Testament saints were given resurrection bodies at that time. Christ was the first fruits, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So in summary then, people have been brought back from the dead prior to this and since. They were restored to life, but they died later. Jesus' resurrection is different. He was raised never to die again. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Christ the first fruits, afterwards those who are Christ at his coming. That's what we have to look forward to. All right, let's move on now to see what does history say about the resurrection. Does history support it? The New Testament is constantly under attack, and its reliability and accuracy are often contested by critics. Now, this table is also reproduced in your notes, so you don't have to frantically write it down. These are some details of writings of a number of ancient authors. Now, note, would you, the time span between the earliest copy that we have and the time it was actually written. And that time span is listed there in the 4th column. It varies from 500 years in the case of Homer up to 1400 years in Aristotle. And the number of copies is relatively small. But when we come to the New Testament, this is what we find. The writings were all much less than 100 years from the copies we have are much less than 100 years since the events. And there are 5,500 documents that are copies of the various scriptures that were written in those days. The critics want to disregard the New Testament, but if they're going to do that, they have to disregard most of the other ancient writings by Plato and Aristotle and Homer and some of the others. New Testament documents are better preserved and far more numerous than any other ancient writings. Now, it is not surprising that secular historians didn't write much about Jesus' first coming. Look at his life. He was born in obscurity and lived for 30 years working as a carpenter in a little town in the north of Israel. His friends and disciples were humble people. They were not the notables of the day. His miracles would only have been seen locally There was no radio, there was no television, there were no DVDs where he could record a message and pass it on, send it to other towns. I think that is incredible that God chose to send Jesus at that time. I guess if we were doing it, we'd wait for television, wouldn't we? He can speak to the world, but that's not the way God did it. He did it at a time when there was no such thing. And Jesus didn't travel beyond Israel. So that's why there aren't a huge number of secular writings about Jesus. And he, in his teaching, didn't at that time turn the world upside down. That happened later. The disciples did so under the power of the Holy Spirit. Look, these who have turned the world upside down have come here too. That's when they came to, I think it was Ephesus, wasn't it? And the people were stirred by the message that he was preaching, the message of the resurrection. Now, nevertheless, there are ancient writings from non-Christian people. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish priest who defected to the Romans when they were attempting to conquer Jerusalem in about AD 68 to 70. He is generally regarded as a reliable historian of that period. He wrote Antiquities of the Jews and another book called Wars of the Jews about AD 93 or 94. He has some sections about Christian matters. He speaks about James, the brother of Jesus and the leader of the early church. He speaks about John the Baptist, and he has a section on Jesus as well. Now, of the three sections, the first two are widely accepted as being accurate and authoritative. The last section, which is called the Testimonium Flavinium, is often not accepted. This is what it said. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvellous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, this particular text is found exactly as verbatim in every copy of Josephus' works now in existence. Until the advent of literary criticism in the late 18th and 19th centuries, 20th century, this was considered authentic. But as you would expect, some critics have declared that certain parts of it are Christian interpolations. They've added to it. The yellow parts are the parts that they say people have added over the years, even though every copy still contains them. That's just what you expect. They're all the sections that speak about Jesus being the Christ and that he rose from the dead. Well, they don't believe that, so of course they say this has been put in there. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1970, a 10th century Arabic version of the Testimonium shares the essential elements of the passage. It doesn't use the same words because it's in Arabic, but it includes Jesus' resurrection. Tertullian was one of the church fathers. He wrote about the year AD 200, and he wrote much to refute the false teaching of the Gnostics. The church father Tertullian, among many others, emphasised the necessity of believing in the physical resurrection of Jesus and said that those who denied the bodily resurrection were heretics. Note that bodily resurrection, that's important. Eusebius also. Now, he was a Roman historian writing about AD 300, and he quotes the Josephus passage about Jesus in essentially the same form as the copies we have today. Eusebius made himself indispensable by his method of authorship. His comprehensive and careful excerpts from original sources saved his successors the painstaking labour of original research. Now, he actually quoted from a fellow called Phlegon. Now, Phlegon was a 1st century Greek historian. His works have been lost, but this is the quote we have that Eusebius wrote at that time. Incidentally, the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad was AD 32. In the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was an eclipse of the sun, greater than any which had occurred previously. At the 6th hour, the day became as dark as night, and the stars were visible in the sky. Now, the 6th hour, of course, is 12 noon. Now, another historian, this is a Christian historian, Julius Africanus, and he wrote, Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th. But what has an eclipse in common with an earthquake, the rending rocks, and the resurrection of the dead, and so great a perturbation throughout the universe? So here are historians mentioning these things, the resurrection and other things that happened at that time. Now, they all mention the eclipse of the sun. Phlegian says there was a full eclipse from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. In those days, the movement of the celestial bodies wasn't nearly as well understood as we understand it, but an eclipse of the sun is not possible in the middle of a Jewish month. That's when the moon is full. The new moon begins the new month. So 14 days later, the 14th of Nisan, the moon is full. It can't happen. The orbits of the sun and the moon severely limit the maximum duration of an eclipse, of a solar eclipse. And it can only be, the astronomers tell us, 7 minutes and 29 seconds anywhere on Earth. So the darkness at Christ's crucifixion was clearly a direct act of God. Well, in summary then, there are better criteria for affirming the New Testament documents than for any other writing. It's good evidence on which to put trust in the reliability of the New Testament. Now, what do the critics say? Those who don't accept that the resurrection actually happened. There has been a revival of a number of old criticisms in the past 20 years, especially in that period. This is a sort of a summary of how criticism has gone over the period. Before World War I, liberal theology had no use for the historical resurrection of Jesus. Strauss and Kersop Lake, they believed the resurrection was a legend or a resurrection in spirit only. After World War I came the rise of neo-orthodoxy, wherein Scripture was not taken literally or historically. Barth and Tillich, they quoted the resurrection of Jesus touches history as a tangent touches a circle, that is, without really touching it. But then after World War II, there was a change, maybe because of the war. A stream of works on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection has flowed forth from German, French and English presses. It's a period where the record of the New Testament was largely accepted as historical fact. Now that has changed. In the last 20 or 30 years, since about 1980, there has been a marked return to the rejection of Jesus' resurrection as a historical fact. In fact, someone has noted that having looked up 1,200 publications on the resurrection of Jesus, most of them offer naturalistic theories for his resurrection. He didn't die or some other thing. What is incredible, what I think is noteworthy, is that is being rejected, and so is creation being rejected. Evolution is taking its place, and so is the fundamental teaching about Jesus on marriage, about God on marriage, one man and one woman. That is being rejected too. All the fundamentals of Christianity are being rejected. Doesn't that point to the return of the Lord soon? I think it does. There's so many people have tried to point to other things. This is a website in India claiming that Jesus' bones are in a tomb in India. It's been there since 1999. There are films that have been shown on television various times declaring that Jesus is buried somewhere else. Here's Japan. They claim they've got the bones of Jesus too, they claim. Little known legend of Jesus in Japan. And that's the burial site of Jesus, so they claim. More recently, in the last few weeks actually, there was a thing on Channel 10 just a few days ago about this find of 10 ossuaries. Ossuaries are bone boxes. They're not coffins, they're smaller boxes. Been unearthed, and they're claiming that they belong to Jesus' family. And the inscriptions are supposed to be similar to the names of the people mentioned in Scripture. Now, these claims stem from this sort of thing. A Hebrew inscription on one of the boxes is the Hebrew name for James. It's seen on an ancient box used to bury bones. Jesus and Joseph were very common names in that period. Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary says that he has a first century letter written by someone named Jesus, addressed to someone else named Jesus, and witnessed by a third person named Jesus. That's how common the name was. Another ossuary bearing the same inscription, Jesus, son of Joseph, that's one of the inscriptions, was revealed by archaeologist Ezilazer Sukenik in 1931 in a lecture in Berlin. 25% of women's names in the first century was Mary. That's how common the name was. More recently, there's been these two films, actually. This film, The Lost Tomb of Jesus, and The Jesus Family Tomb is a later one by this same fellow, James Cameron. The archaeological community is nearly unanimous in condemning the Jesus Family Tomb as a hoax, with no basis in history or archaeology. James Cameron also produced the film The Titanic. So these films have a lot of holes in it too. Like the Titanic, they're doomed to sink. All right, what do the critics say yet further? The Gospels have conflicting reports. Okay, when we look at the table, and this is produced in your notes too, there appear to be discrepancies in some of the records in the various four writings. And the critics claim that some of them have got to be wrong because they're different. Well, this fellow, Dr. John Wenham, made a study of these documents. He wrote a book. In fact, he's written several books. This is one of them. And he was wondering whether the accounts were in fact in conflict. And this is what he said. Now, it so happens that the story of Jesus' resurrection is told by 5 different writers whose accounts differ from each other to an astonishing degree. And so he went on to examine them in great detail. Now let's look at the first one of those that was in the list, a number of women at the tomb. In Matthew we read there were 2 people, Mary Magdalene and Mary. In Mark we read 2 Marys and Salome. In Luke, more than 3, because there were other women. In John 20, only Mary is mentioned. Now, some of the Greek manuscripts omit and certain other women from the record. Now, it's quite clear that in the writing that the various authors wrote, they referred to the ones who were relevant to the point they were making. In the case of John, he was only speaking about Mary. Obviously, there were others. The number of messengers at the tomb. Matthew says 1 angel, then men in Mark and Luke, and John says 2 angels. Well, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting at the head and the other at the feet where the body of Jesus had lain. Now, once again, Matthew only mentions 1, obviously 2 were present. The fact that men are used is not unusual. Angels appeared as men almost always throughout Scripture. The visit to the tomb. Matthew says dawn. Mark says the sun had risen. Luke says dawn. John says it was still dark. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. So there seem to be variant reports on this. Now, Mary's home was in Bethany. So they had to walk from Bethany to Jerusalem carrying a load of spices. Now, not being too sure how far it was from Bethany to Jerusalem, I did what any normal human would do. I asked Google, how far is Bethany from Jerusalem? And I got back the answer, 11,055 kilometres. You see, I didn't account for the fact that there's a Bethany in Oklahoma. And the Americans only know about Bethany in Oklahoma, apparently. Yes, in fact, John tells us that it was 15 furlongs, about 2 miles distant. So it was going to take them a while to walk from Bethany to Jerusalem. And so clearly they started out in the dark and the sun had risen on the way. So there's no discrepancy there. It's just the different point at which it's recorded. And John Wenham came to this conclusion. He said, these records exhibit the characteristics of accurate and independent reporting. For superficially they show great disharmony, but on close examination the details gradually fall into place. They do not disagree. There is harmony. So that is not supported by the evidence. Well, there's another common claim, and that is that Jesus didn't actually die. He revived later. Now, this fellow, Henrik Paulus, his main interest was in producing natural explanations for biblical miracles. And he wrote about 1828, and this was the first time such a theory had ever been offered, 1800 years after the event. Jesus didn't die on the cross. He'd fallen into a coma, revived and rolled away the stone, evaded the Roman guards, appeared to the disciples, proclaimed he had conquered death and died later. Quite an outstanding claim. Look at this. The linen wrapped around Jesus' body contained 45 kilograms of spices. That's what they did at the time they buried him. That's more than 2 bags of cement. If you carry a bag of cement, it's 2 bags wrapped up in your body. He was there from late afternoon on Thursday until Sunday morning. We can't go into this. Christ was crucified on Thursday afternoon, between the evenings, not Friday. That is common misunderstanding. So he was there for 3 days, from late afternoon on Thursday until Sunday morning. If he just walked out, why didn't the soldiers arrest him? And anyway, the soldiers who crucified him and the guard who were guarding him would have been put to death if he had got away. Here's another suggestion, the Passover plot theory, a book by this fellow Hugh Schonfield. He says that Jesus planned an elaborate escape plot to deceive the world. He sought help from Lazarus and Joseph of Arimathea. He was given a drink on the cross to lose consciousness and appear dead, and he was removed alive from the tomb the following day. This fellow was a Jewish Bible scholar who lived in Britain, and this book became a bestseller, I think naturally. Supports the false theory. Unfortunately, apparently in this they didn't plan on the spear wound inflicted by the soldiers. So he claimed that Jesus briefly regained consciousness and appeared to his disciples and died soon after and was buried elsewhere. Now, deception is not a new accusation. John 7:12 says this, and there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said he is good. Others said, no, on the contrary, he deceives the people. So that's been said all along, right from the time he was on earth. These historians recorded, and all the historians say that Jesus died on the cross. There was no doubt at all. By law, Roman soldiers had to make sure Jesus was dead because they risked execution if their duties were not carried out to the full. So it was for this reason the Roman soldiers thrust a spear into Jesus' side to make certain of Jesus' death. David Strauss was a critic who denied the deity of Christ and much else, and he said this, even he as a critic said this, it is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to his disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave. And that comes from a critic who doesn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, this is from John, and it's almost as if John was telling his readers, look, I don't understand this, it's really strange, and I'm not lying, I actually saw this. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. Now, this brief verse provides modern medical doctors with evidence that demolishes the swoon theory and any other theory that claims that Jesus didn't die. This is a report from an abstract of a longer paper from the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 1986. And it says clear, just the last part there, modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. There is no question about it. Jesus died on the cross of Calvary. So, that is not supported by the evidence either. Well, they also now try and tell us that the witnesses were hallucinating. Now, a hallucination is a false perception occurring without any identifiable external stimulus. These are the disorders that are associated with hallucination. A whole list of them there. I'm not going to try and read them. It's a symptom of either a medical, a neurological or mental disorder. Now, hallucinations, they tell us, are individual, just like fingerprints. Different people have different hallucinations. Even two people who have the same disorder don't have the same hallucinations. Paul tells us that after that, that's after he had risen from the dead. He was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Paul is saying, look, they're still alive. They can refute this if they want to. And he's saying 500 people saw Jesus. They didn't all hallucinate the same way at the same time. There's no possibility. Now, the notion of the central thoughts in those days was that there was no resurrection of the dead. Greek culture, Roman culture, and all of the various philosophers of that period all maintained that death could not be reversed. So there was no inbuilt notion in them to say someone will rise from the dead. The Jewish culture, now they believed in resurrection, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but Pharisees confessed both. So Pharisees did accept that there would be a resurrection at some point. But we understand more about that when we look at what Jesus said to Mary, or what Mary said to Jesus. Jesus said to her, it was Martha, not Mary. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That was the philosophy then. They understood that there would be a resurrection. Not yet, not then, but at the last day. So on several counts, the hallucination theory becomes ridiculous, and it is not supported by the evidence that we have. Well, there's also the notion that it wasn't Jesus who appeared to people, it was someone else, not him. It's even been suggested it might have been his twin brother. Well, take that as you may. Now, there are certain scriptures that might support this, and we'll look at them. Now, that's Mary, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. Now, Mary recognised Jesus by his voice, not by his appearance. Then remember when Jesus walked to Emmaus with those two disciples? Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were restrained, so they did not know him. It wasn't till they had a meal together and he said thanks, and they probably saw the nail prints in his hands. They realised this was Jesus, but they didn't recognise him by appearance. This is the upper room on Sunday evening. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they still did not believe for joy and marvelled. So even Jesus showing them his hands, there's some doubt. He had to eat food in their presence to prove his identity and show them the marks on his hand. And when he was ascending to heaven, as recorded in Matthew, when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. Even then, some of them had some reservations. Now, so these on four occasions, Jesus was not immediately recognised. Could this be construed to imply that it was not Jesus? Critics have claimed that it was someone else, yes, even his twin brother. But there is a more obvious explanation. Jesus was so abused by the Roman soldiers that his appearance was barely made human. Isaiah tells us in prophecy, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And we also read, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. The soldiers added to his suffering and his humiliation by pulling out his beard. This probably left scars on his face. We know that the scars on his hands and feet were not removed, so it's quite possible that the other scars weren't removed either. Here is a photograph of a man with a beard. Here is the same man without it. I have a friend who always had a beard, and he shaved it off, and I hardly recognised him. I didn't know it was the same fella. Jesus was so badly abused that his physical appearance was changed. So instead of casting doubt upon the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, it rather seems to support it. If it wasn't Christ whom they saw, who was it that was taken up into heaven? And when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up and a cloud received him out of their sight. So that is not supported by the evidence either. And then there's the theory that someone stole the body. Now, the one thing that is never doubted, even by the critics, is the tomb was in fact empty. They agree to that. Everyone at the time agreed to that. The Pharisees agreed to it. The tomb was empty. There was no question about that. There was no body in the tomb. So what happened to it? Well, the tomb was under the watch of several Roman soldiers. Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. But when the body was missing, when they had assembled with the elders, that's the soldiers, when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers. Why would the authorities pay a large sum of money for no reason? If they had stolen the body, just produce it. They said to the soldiers, "Tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while he slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him." Now, the penalty for a Roman soldier losing his prisoner was death. That's why the chief priest promised to pacify the governor if it ever came to his ears. They say the disciples stole and hid the body. If they stole and hid Jesus' body, they knew he didn't rise from the dead. This is from a man who wrote much of the civil law and the interpretation of civil law for the United States justice system. The great truth that the apostles declared was that Christ had risen from the dead. Propagating this new faith, they could expect nothing but contempt, opposition, revilings, bitter persecutions, beatings, imprisonments, torments and cruel deaths. They had every possible motive to review carefully the grounds of their faith and the evidence for this great truth they asserted. If their testimony was not true, there was no possible motive for its fabrication. Simon Greenfield, Professor of Law at Harvard University. The disciples paid a heavy price for their preaching that Christ had risen from the dead. Look at this. This is what happened to most of to all of the apostles. Only one wasn't actually killed for his faith. That was John. He was thrown into boiling oil, but he survived. Men don't go through that on the basis of a lie. Only John survived to old age. Now, it was common in those days to venerate the site of someone's burial, the tomb. There were at least 50 such sites in Jesus' day. Since there was no such shrine for Jesus, it indicates that his bones weren't there. Jesus' tomb was never venerated as a shrine. This is striking because it was the first century custom to set up a shrine at the site of a holy man's bones. Now, I have another suggestion that I might consider. You see, we know there was a garden where Jesus' tomb was. We know there was a gardener because Mary thought it was the gardener that she'd seen Jesus. So it must have been the gardener that took the body. Now, the gardener knew that this man, Jesus, was a famous man and his tomb would become a holy site. He didn't want busloads of tourists stomping all over his flowers, so he took it. Well, it's just as stupid as the other suggestions, isn't it? Yes, and why did the grave clothes get left there? He, John, stooping down, looking in, saw the linen clothes lying there. So that too is not supported by the evidence, but the tomb was empty. All right, finally, what do authorities say? And there are some people who are well equipped to be able to look at this evidence and assess it. This man, who I read an extract from his before, he was the principal founder of the Harvard Law School. He wrote the treatise on the law of evidence, and that has become the basis of the US legal system ever since. He was an atheist for many years, and he used to put down the Christians in his law classes. He used to ridicule them for their belief. But one day, the Christian students challenged him to investigate the case for Christ's resurrection. After examining the evidence based on the rules of evidence, Greenleaf became a Christian and wrote a classic testimony of the evangelists. Let the gospel's testimony be sifted as if it were given in a court of justice on the side of the adverse party, the witness being subjugated to a rigorous cross-examination. The result, it is confidently believed, will be an undoubting conviction of their integrity, ability and truth. He declared that the evidence was sound after having doubted it initially. In fact, his conclusion was this: the resurrection is one of the best established facts of history. Here's another, Sir Lionel Lithgow. He is considered one of the greatest lawyers in British history. He won 245 consecutive legal trials. He never lost a trial. 245 of them in sequence. So he was good at assessing evidence. He says, I have spent more than 42 years as a defence trial lawyer in many parts of the world. I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance and leaves absolutely no room for doubt. Sir Lionel Lithgow. This man received 2 knighthoods, so he's a very prominent man, and yet he came to this conclusion. What about a historian's assessment? Sir Thomas Arnold was Professor of Modern History at Oxford University, and this is what he said: I have for many years studied the history of other times and examined and weighed the evidence of those who have written about it. I know of no other fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort than the great sign which God has given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. Another, a judge, Lord Darling from the English High Court. The evidence points unmistakably to the fact that on the third day Jesus rose. There exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection is true. Yes, indeed. Now, this is another authority. Indeed, excuse me, taking all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. Nothing but the antecedent assumption that it must be false could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. Professor B.F. Westcott from Cambridge University. Well, is the resurrection of Jesus proven beyond any possible doubt? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Why? Does that surprise you? There's plenty of evidence to support it, but the evidence has to fall short of irrefutable proof. Why? This is what God says. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Evidence falls short of absolute proof because you can't argue against it. You can't have any other choice. And God has given us a free will, and he doesn't violate that free will. There has to be a step of faith. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and rewards those who come to him. The skeptic can taunt, you can't prove God, and he's right. But one of the amazing aspects of God's revelation of himself is that he has left plenty of evidence. There are courtrooms all over the world every day deciding serious cases where the men are being sometimes put to death on the basis of those decisions. And they're making those decisions on the basis of evidence that falls short of absolute proof. So it is not invalid for God to expect the same. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Faith has to be a part of it. So yes, there's plenty of evidence, loads of evidence, but we still have to accept it as a step of faith. We are greatly blessed because we have believed and yet not seen. Jesus said to Thomas, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We have not seen. We are taking the evidence of others, but we believe that Christ rose again from the dead. You know, there's just one more important question. Perhaps it's the most important question of all, and it's this. What do you say? We have to decide for ourselves on the evidence that's presented. Thank you.